In Texas, a 400-acre development near Dallas became ground zero for a high-stakes clash over sovereignty, law, and what it means to build a community in America.
And welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are dissecting a really intense conflict. We're looking at the political and legal campaign waged by Texas state officials against a proposed community called Epic City.
It's affiliated with the East Plano Islamic Center, or EPIC. And this story, it's just a shortcut to understanding this collision of land use, law, and, well, high-stakes politics.
Our mission here is to really unpack the state's strategy, and it was a multi-pronged strategy.
Right, this wasn't just a politician making a speech. We're talking brand new state legislation being passed very quickly.
And on top of that, the launch of at least 5 simultaneous investigations, one of which was criminal.
And the state's justification for all of this was the claim that this development threatened to impose Sharia law and create what they kept calling no-go zones.
Okay, so let's set the scene with the 90-second news hook. The whole thing really ignited in February of 2025.
That's when Governor Abbott came out publicly against the Epic City project.
And his concern, which he stated over and over, was that it was promoting Sharia law and, quote, Sharia cities.
The state's response was, it's incredibly fast and aggressive. It moved on 2 major fronts.
First, you had the lawmakers. They introduced and passed House Bill 4211, or HB 4211.
And this law was basically rushed through specifically to stop developments from creating these so-called no-go zones.
Then second, you have the state officials, especially Attorney General Ken Paxton's office. They launched what you can only call a legal siege.
At least 5 active probes, including that criminal investigation we mentioned, all hitting the developers at the same time.
The state's position was simple. They said they were defending Texans from a potential discriminatory or illegal compound. That was the phrase the governor's office used.
So the big question here, the thing that this all boils down to, is just how far will the state go using its full legal and regulatory power to stop a private development?
Especially when the developers are insisting, very publicly, that they are following every single federal and state law on the books.
Okay, so let's unpack the development itself. What exactly is Epic City? What was the plan before this political firestorm just blew up?
At its core, it's a huge development plan. 402 acres near Josephine, Texas, master plan.
So homes, shops, that kind of thing.
That and more. The plan called for over 1,000 homes, yes, but also a large mosque, a K-12 faith-based school, a community college, and commercial space.
And the push for this came from the East Plano Islamic Center.
Directly. The Muslim population in North Texas has been growing very, very quickly. They just saw a need for a dedicated, community-focused space.
And you can tell the need was there. One of the most memorable details from our sources was the market demand. It was immediate.
Oh, it was undeniable. More than 500 lots were reserved within just a few days of the public launch in 2024.
Which tells you everything. The community was ready for this. They were on board.
Absolutely. The economics were sound, the project was moving ahead, but this is where the whole thing shifts, from a business story to a political one.
Right. The controversy really exploded after conservative commentators started framing it in a very different way.
A much more insidious way. It was being labeled on major platforms as a 402-acre Sharia city.
And that's the phrase that caught fire. Governor Abbott then amplified that fear in February 2025.
He essentially moved the rhetoric from social media right into the governor's office.
He made that very firm statement saying, to be clear, Sharia law is not allowed in Texas, nor are Sharia cities, nor are no-go zones, which this project seems to imply.
And just like that, the state's official position was one of defense. They were acting to defend communities against, quote, any threats posed by Epic City.
So the rhetoric immediately became the justification for legal and legislative action.
Precisely. And what's crucial for you to understand is that the state wasn't waiting for a violation to happen. They were legislating against a perceived future threat.
A threat that was rooted entirely in this fear of religious exclusivity.
And that rhetoric, as you said, it quickly became law. Which brings us to House Bill 4211. How was that used to target this project?
Well, HB 4211 was fast-tracked, signed by the governor with a really explicit goal.
To prevent developments like Epic City from creating these no-go zones.
Okay, let's stop and define that term because it drove the whole conversation. What does no-go zone actually mean in the context of this Texas law?
It's not about, physical walls or gates. It's more fundamental.
To the community structure.
Right. In this context, it implies an area where residency is restricted based on something like religious affiliation. You're creating an exclusive enclave.
So HB 4211 was designed to make sure developers couldn't legally sell or rent land only to people who share their religion.
Exactly. It's basically reinforcing federal Fair Housing Act principles, but at the state level.
But with this very specific framing?
Yes. The governor himself said the law was signed to defend Texas from entities trying to create a discriminatory or illegal compound.
But the developers, their attorney Dan Cogdell, he had a very different take on it.
The strong counterpoint, yeah. He called the law political theater.
Said it was designed so Governor Abbott could claim victory over an evil that never existed.
Which is a powerful statement. But despite calling it politically motivated, the developers also made it clear they would comply.
In fact, their attorney said the development supports the new legislation.
And he confirmed, quote, anyone is welcome to buy and live there. They insisted their plan was always to be inclusive and follow the Fair Housing Act.
So the problem wasn't their plan, it was the perception of their plan.
And that perception opened the door for the state's real attack vector, the regulatory and legal siege.
This is where it gets really intense. Beyond the new law, the state launched this massive effort. Let's talk about the scope of these investigations.
This is what makes this case so unusual. It wasn't just one inquiry. It was a sophisticated, multi-front legal attack. At least 5 active probes were announced in a very short time.
Involving big agencies, too. The Attorney General's Office, the Texas Workforce Commission.
The sheer number of them. That's the strategy. It puts the developers under immediate and immense pressure. They have to spend time and money fighting on multiple fronts at once.
It seems like the goal was just to bury them in regulatory paperwork. What were the specific things they were looking into?
The net was incredibly wide. First, potential discrimination against non-Muslims. That directly ties into the no-go zone fear and the Texas Fair Housing Act.
Okay, that makes sense with the rhetoric. What else?
Second, potential financial harm to investors. So they're looking at the project's funding, how the lots were sold, securities compliance.
Right, consumer protection.
That was the third one, violations of Texas consumer protection laws, which is a very broad category.
And then the fourth one, this is the one that really stands out.
The most unusual, for sure. Operating illegal funeral services.
Wait, illegal funeral services, how does that even connect to a residential zoning dispute?
It highlights just how comprehensive this siege was. A charge like that, even if it seems absurd, allows investigators to access records for every single entity tied to the development.
So it's a pressure point, a flank they never would have expected to defend.
It's a maximal pressure point. And the state didn't stop there. The conflict went to the site itself. Governor Abbott ordered them to cease construction.
Claiming they were violating state permitting laws.
Right. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, the TCEQ, claimed they hadn't received the necessary applications.
But the developers pushed back on that.
They did. Their position was they were still in the due diligence phase, doing surveys, initial plans. They argued they hadn't actually begun the kind of construction that would require those permits yet.
So regardless of who was right, the state's strategy was working.
It seems so. The Epic City organizers themselves admitted that all these investigations, just the sheer weight of them, have delayed their progress by several months.
The delay itself became the weapon.
Which brings us to the federal findings. And this is where the story gets another fascinating twist. Because the U.S. Department of Justice also looked into the project.
This was after Senator John Cornyn raised some concerns. What did the DOJ find?
Well, they officially closed their investigation.
Just like that.
Pretty much. They ended the inquiry after the developers gave them a formal promise, a pledge to abide by all federal fair housing laws.
And the developer's attorney called that a win.
Of course. The federal government was satisfied with their commitment to non-discrimination.
Which is so interesting. The federal inquiry closes, but the Texas state probes are still active. And they're targeting everything from finance to, well, funeral services.
It really suggests a difference in goals, doesn't it? The state's continued legal siege is the main thing halting all progress now.
The developer's attorney, Dan Cogdell, he pointed this out. He called the whole thing unprecedented.
He did. And he even speculated that if this development were centered around a Christian place of worship, the reaction from the state government, quote, might have been different.
Which really gets to the political heart of it. But to be fair, we should also note that local residents had other concerns, right? Concerns that weren't about religion at all.
Absolutely. And that's an important piece of context. There were legitimate, practical worries about infrastructure.
Things like increased traffic on what are basically narrow rural roads.
The environmental impact, the strain on local utilities and services, these are the classic zoning challenges you see with any large-scale development anywhere in the country.
The religious identity of the organizers just put all those standard concerns under a hyper-politicized microscope.
Exactly.
So to wrap this all up, we've seen a local land deal just explode into this massive state versus developer conflict.
Resulting in a new state law, HB 4211, and a barrage of state investigations.
All leading to major project delays. And the state's framing, led by the governor, was that this was all a necessary defense against discrimination and potential illegal compounds.
But the key takeaway here is the mechanism they used. The federal investigation closed once the developers pledged to follow the law. The state's legal and regulatory campaign, however, continued.
And that campaign seems to be the primary tool being used right now to stop the project from moving forward.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to consider. When a state uses the full weight of its legal and regulatory machine like this, scrutinizing zoning, finance, environmental permits, everything, does the planning process itself get weaponized?
Does that turn standard procedure into a political tool? A way to control or even halt development based on the perceived identity of the organizers, rather than on their actual compliance with the law? Something to think about.